So that's where we are today. The video released a little more than a week ago, the video of Sterling Brown coming several months, the incident actually taking place in January. So I want to set the stage for you a little bit. This is a very special edition of Wisconsin's Afternoon News, a community conversation, the Sterling Brown incident. We are going to go through what we saw in the video. We are going to go through what happened that night. But more than anything, we want to take the next step. Where do we go from here? How do we learn from this? How is the African-American community doing today in light of what happened and in light of where we sit today? A couple of housekeeping things. I want to tell you who's going to be on the show and who's not going to be on the show. We will have on the show Robert Willis, a police training expert. We will have Markasa Tucker, African-American Roundtable, the director of that organization, Mandela Barnes, former state representative. And we're also hoping to have Ashanti Hamilton, the president of the Milwaukee Common Council. You'll also hear this hour from Mike Crivello, the head of the Milwaukee Police Association. Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett. You'll hear from Sterling Brown as well. We asked the Milwaukee Bucks to be part of this program. They declined our offers. We will read a statement from the Bucks coming up a little bit later on in the show. The Milwaukee Police Department also turned down all of our requests to be part of this program. But that's why it's really important to have this discussion. I was surprised, frankly. I also reached out to almost every single member of the Milwaukee Common Council, literally, and almost every one of them told me no. And I didn't hear back from most of the others. They did not want to be part of this conversation, which just points out that it's a very important conversation to be having. Maybe it's uncomfortable. Maybe the questions aren't comfortable. But for our community, this community conversation is the right thing to do. I want to bring in right now Robert Willis, author of Wisconsin's Defensive and Arrest Tactics Manual. He trains police officers. Mr. Willis, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me here.
What were your first impressions when you saw the video?
They were not positive. I didn't believe it was Milwaukee Police's finest hour, and I did not believe it represented what the majority of police officers in America would have done to handle that particular situation. It didn't, to me, represent the training values that we as trainers try to represent. There were some aspects of it I did certainly understand. We can talk about those things. But all in all, we can do better, much better.
Let's go through both of those. What did officers do right in this incident? And then I'm going to ask you what they did wrong. What did they do right?
Well, they certainly were correct in investigating the situation. It's, I'm not going to say the highest crime area in the city, but it is a high crime area. It was early in the morning, and a vehicle was parked in what might be deemed a somewhat suspicious manner. At first perspective, you're thinking, well, this is really only a traffic violation. But from the perspective of the officer, this could also be an armed robbery in progress. It could be a number of different things. So the officer correctly did not rush in. He stopped, tried to assess the situation, and then made contact with the subject when that subject came out of the Walgreens, and they started to have a conversation. So, you know, I don't fault any of that. That's good police work. You know, we work for the community. We want things to be safe. Checking on this rather than just driving on by and ignoring it was a good thing.
Where did things go wrong? What did you see that really bothered you or you thought was handled incorrectly?
Well, it started out with the officer saying something like, "How you doing?" or "Hi," or something like that. And from that moment on, it started to go wrong. It started to go downhill. The initial verbal interaction really did not represent what officers in Wisconsin and literally around the country, because I have trained in all 50 states, trained officers in all 50 states, didn't really represent what officers are trained to do to treat citizens with dignity and respect.
Was it disrespectful? Was it too casual? What did you not like about that?
What it did is it started what we as trainers sometimes call the negative dance. We're supposed to be contact professionals. We're supposed to look at a situation and understand that there is always friction and always going to be friction between the police and between citizens. You know, for one reason, officer survival. That officer showed up on that scene. He's got a family to go home to, and he knows that in situations perhaps very similar to the way this appeared originally, officers have been injured and have been killed. So you've got the friction of an officer not being able to read the future, wanting to be safe and keep everybody else safe. You've also got the friction that's in the task of being a police officer. And that sometimes is created by one of the things we do is ferret out crime. So consequently, an officer is looking for probable cause of criminal activity. It's that search or that quest for probable cause, which sometimes, in fact, does rub citizens the wrong way. And I understand that, but that is what we want officers to do, is establish if there's a crime in progress or not, and simply make an arrest if the probable cause does exist. Now, there's good ways of doing that, and there's not so good ways, desirable and not so desirable ways. So a big part of law enforcement training is not just driving cars and shooting guns. It's on becoming this contact professional. It's on this verbal interaction that starts something. You know, everybody, as soon as a police officer makes contact with them, whether it's a speeding ticket or what, wants to know why they're being stopped. You know, and the training that has been done by the Milwaukee Police Department, by people way before, kind of mandates that the universal question is why? Why have you stopped me? Why are you hassling me? Why can't I just leave? So why not answer that right away rather than start this negative dance back and forth of you did something. Oh, no, I didn't do anything. Yes, you did. Give me your driver's license. Why do I have to? I didn't do anything. Please tell me what I've done. And it just goes back and forth, and that the negative tone is set almost immediately.
We're speaking with police training expert Robert Willis. Robert, let me ask you this. A lot of people may be wondering, when it comes to use of force, is there a difference between trained techniques that you learn by the book and not trained techniques but justified, sort of textbook versus street application?
Well, it sounds to me like you've read the manual. Right? There's actually 3 designations of technique. One is a trained technique, the way we train it in the academy. Unfortunately, the academy is a very sterile atmosphere, and most of the time the people who are playing the subjects are pretty cooperative, and they're somewhat predictable. But yes, very often officers can do exactly what they have been trained to do. Then there is another designation of technique, and that is the dynamic application of a trained technique. Basically, that means taking it out of that sterile environment of the classroom and putting it into the real world and then applying that technique. And then there is not trained at all, but still justified. An example of that might be we don't really train officers to run people over. But you could envision a circumstance where an officer had the right to shoot someone, but the only weapon at his disposal at that moment was his squad car or hers, and they used it as a weapon. Not trained, but again, could be certainly justified. Then, of course, there's not trained and not justified.
So was the taser justified?
Well, you know, I wasn't there. I didn't feel. That's the problem with video, is you don't feel what's happening. You get a sense of what's happening. You get a visual of what is happening. And, you know, it's a matter of perspective. Everything in life is perspectives. The perspective of the camera, the perspective of the officer is different than the perspective of the camera. Sometimes it's 90 degrees or 180 degrees removed. There's no tactile sense and a bunch of other things. If the officer made a demand, get your hands out of your pockets, and it wasn't heeded, the threshold for the use of the taser is generally active resistance or its threat. That's language right from the manual. If ignoring a police command and trying to put your hands into your pockets or refusing to take them out of the pockets is considered active resistance, and some might say it's not, it's only passive, then yes, the taser would be appropriate to use. Not mandatory, but certainly one of the tools that could possibly be used, as could pain compliance, as could pepper spray. But again, it's up to the officer to justify that. You know, we talked about hands in or out of pockets. The fact of the matter is, I've watched the video many times, and that gentleman's hands were in and out of his pockets several times. The question becomes, why was it such an important issue several minutes into this contact as versus immediately?
So that's the question that I've heard a lot. He had his hands in and out of his pockets off and on. It was January. It was cold outside. And suddenly they asked him to take your hands out of your pocket after I've watched the videotape numerous times. For 8 minutes, he had his hands in his pockets off and on. Suddenly it was take your hands out of your pocket. He said, I have something in my hands, and declined to immediately take his hands out. And next thing you know, he was on the ground and the taser was utilized.
Well, I can even add to that perspective. I imagine he was also very nervous.
Sure.
As far as he was concerned, he maybe had committed a traffic violation, a parking violation, and suddenly there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squad cars and multiple officers. From his perspective, I can understand him certainly being nervous. Putting hands in pockets, withdrawing is certainly a sign of being nervous. I read something. I haven't verified anything. I've seen the video several times. I've not read police reports. But again, I've kept abreast of this by listening to TV programs and reading the papers. One of the officers apparently said that they did take a look in the car, and you'll see officers with flashlights looking inside the car. They said they saw what appeared to be firearms targets inside the car. There appeared to be holes in these firearms targets. Well, I guess one could perhaps presume that maybe a weapon might be present. I understand the question was asked of him, of Sterling Brown, do you have a firearms permit? And his answer, I believe, was no. But this is all conjecture. I don't know this firsthand. It's just what I believe at this moment to have happened. Could that have caused an officer a little bit more concerned about a weapon? It could have. It could have. But, you know, I'd have to see the reports and other things to see whether or not that would be enough to justify the demand. It's a common precept in police training that hands kill. Hands kill. Control the hands. It's a legitimate concern to control the hands, but everything has to be taken into context. The context of this situation was what appeared to be a parking violation. It then got a little contentious because of what the officer said and perhaps even because of what Mr. Brown said, all right? There was no yelling, screaming, really bad argumentation there, but it was, you could tell there was confrontation in progress.
Tension.
Tension on both sides. You had tension to, not being able to control the hands, to other visual cues. Again, I wasn't there. I don't know. You just have to be a bit more intimate with these things. The video just doesn't tell the whole picture, although it certainly does tell a lot.
Let's go to the multiple officers who responded to the scene. From the video, he asked for backup. And then I believe 8 officers show up, maybe a little bit less than that. Why didn't the manager on call, the supervisor on call, say, I only need one backup, the rest of you go out to your posts, go back out on the streets?
The original officer who called for backup even reinforced that. He told one of his fellow officers, perhaps the supervisor, I only called for one squad, that's all I need, and this is what shows up. Was it a slow night? I don't know. It almost goes without saying that nighttime traffic stops and citizen contacts are a bit more dangerous than daytime. All right, even our own Supreme Court in Wisconsin has said in a case that one element of danger can be night versus day. It's almost automatic on almost all police departments that even if not asked for, a backup is sent.
But to Melissa's point, once all those officers showed up and they realized they were all there, and a source in the police department told me that they believed that was every street officer in that district showed up there that night, why at that point didn't one of the sergeants say, we don't need everybody here, we need you out protecting the rest of this part of the city? Or could he at that point have sent some of them back out instead of all 8 standing around Mr. Brown?
Well, he certainly could have, and it's my understanding that actually the heaviest discipline was meted upon supervisors at the scene for not doing that. So apparently the chief agrees with that this presence was not called for at that time, that supervisors on the scene should have dismissed some of those officers, get them back on the street, and that keeping all those officers there was just not a desirable or positive thing.
Can't the addition of extra officers in itself escalate a situation? More officers are there. The person, in this case, Mr. Brown, is surrounded, tense, stressed out. There's now 2 officers. There's 4 officers. There's an SUV that pulls up and 2 more get out. The van pulls up. Now there's 8 officers. Can that feed itself?
Well, we're talking hypotheticals here. There are some situations where there should be multiple officers, and wouldn't bad guys like it if we sent officers away?
Well, let's talk about a situation like this with a car double parked.
Yeah, this situation here, apparently the chief believes that some of those officers should have left. Earlier in my discussion with you, I mentioned that I could imagine from Sterling Brown's perspective, this made him quite nervous for a number of reasons.
Hey, I want to get to the mindset of officers and Mr. Brown in this case, and I know you can't read minds, none of us can, but in general, take us inside the mindset of a police officer in a situation like this. It's night, it's late at night, a car double parked in an area that's been robbed many times, in a crime-ridden area. What goes through the mindset of an officer when he comes upon a situation like this? And I know it varies from officer to officer, but can you give us some perspective?
Yes, I can. About once every 47 to 50 hours in this country, an officer is killed. That's once every couple of days. So the officer certainly has that perspective, that this could be the last call I go to. The officer also has knowledge of the area, the crimes that have been committed in that area, and the officer's first job is to go there and assess the situation. The mindset should be not to rush in, to assess the situation. If it appears to need so, to call for backup. And you just sometimes have to consider the possible worst until proven otherwise. So I understand that mindset. I've taught officer survival for decades. I understand that mindset. I think the public does also. But when that first contact occurs, and it appears that the context has changed from this could be an armed robbery, this could be almost anything, to, well, this is seemingly a parking violation, and a difficult person or an unhappy citizen, well, that does change things quite a bit. And you can see here how that didn't turn out very positive.
Robert, how does prior experience go into how police handle future situations? Say, if this officer had maybe an experience like this in the past, and how does he approach this situation now?
Well, prior experience is a big component of how officers respond to things. I might add, and again, you're going to talk to the president of the Milwaukee Police Union, so I don't want to steal his thunder, but he believes that part of this whole thing is understaffing. So an officer goes into a situation, believes, he's in a car all by himself. That certainly can cause a lot of consternation on the part of the officer. And I kind of apologize. I almost lost track of the question there. If you could just kind of restate it for me.
How does the officer's prior experience go into how they handle future situations?
We're all creatures of our prior experience. Not only perhaps, and I'm not speaking for Milwaukee, I'm just mouthing what was said by the president of the police union, understaffed, but also there's a degree of underexperience, and this is not strange to Milwaukee or any department. Your most experienced officers, the ones you might hope would handle cases like this at times of the day that there's more tension, sometimes aren't working that shift. You might find a late shift like that, a night shift, where even the supervisors only have a few years on, and some of the officers only have 1 or 2 or 3 years on, which is not a whole lot of police experience. So, sometimes imaginations can run wild. Certainly experience can dictate how one approaches a situation, but you have to temper experience with training. And you have to temper that with department policy and other things too. This is a complex issue. There's many things that we can discuss. If I could add one thing quickly, when critiquing an incident like this, and I learned this from a friend of mine in the Green Bay area where I worked quite a long time, former sheriff and undersheriff. Anytime there's an incident like that, instead of immediately playing the blame game, whose fault is this? Is it the citizen's fault? Is it the police officer's fault? The question always was asked, how have we failed? How has this department failed? Have we failed this officer? Does this officer and the way he acted represent the way I want myself as chief or sheriff to be represented out there? And then you have to go out and find the facts. Now, if the officer misrepresented the department and training, that's one thing. But if the officer had been failed by not having enough training or not really meaningful training or not integrated use of force training, meaning that it's not only shoot the gun, decide whether to shoot or not, but it's all the verbal packaging that goes into a use of force contact, well, that's when change becomes necessary. So hopefully incidents like this, fortunately not an extremely serious use of force. Taser is fairly low on the spectrum of use of force, but I've been tasered and I don't want it to happen again, all right? It's not pleasant. I understand that. Hopefully one can learn from this and, again, find out if there's blame to be meted out. You know, we talk about community policing. I understand that. But, again, you have this friction that exists of officers meting out crime and finding probable cause.
Mr. Willis, we only have 1 minute left. And I want to make sure I ask you this. In 1 minute, how should citizens act when approached by police? What's the primary thing they should think about and they should act if it's a traffic stop, a speeding situation? What's the one or two most important things they can do to de-escalate a situation?
Well, if you're going to put it on citizens, it would be keep your hands visible, and if reasonable, do what the officer says. Now, people may not like that, but in the state of Wisconsin, it is state law that it's illegal for a citizen to resist an arrest. It's court where that is supposed to be figured out, not in a street confrontation or argument with the police officer.
Should they turn their dome light on? Should they hold their license out the window? Are those things valuable? Should they not do that?
No, those things are all good. Again, it keeps the hands. It shows a level of cooperation, right? And again, you may not like what's going on, just like sometimes you didn't like what was going on when your parents told you to do things. But probably the wisest thing to do is deal with the situation cooperatively, keep your hands visible, do what the officer says without editorial comment, and later on register your complaint, whether that be a citizen's complaint to the police department, whether that be a civil lawsuit, or perhaps even criminal prosecution of that officer. Those things can all happen after the fact.
Police Training Officer Robert Willis, great perspective. Thanks for the depth on that. We appreciate you being with us, Mr. Willis.
Anytime. Thank you.
On January 26, 2018, at approximately 2 o'clock a.m., members of the Milwaukee Police Department encountered Sterling Brown near 2700 block of West National Avenue, and this was regarding a parking violation.
2 a.m. Friday, was arrested by police at a Walgreens on the south side after they saw his vehicle parked across two handicapped spaces.
Milwaukee police used a taser on Sterling Brown during an incident on the south side early this morning.
Video, lots of it, we're told, body cam video, was part of the investigation, and that video is scheduled to be released this afternoon.
There's going to be a video that's going to come out soon involving the department. And I'm going to be honest with you, we're going to need your support during the challenges.
Several sources who have seen the video told the paper that Brown did absolutely nothing to provoke the officers.
Today we are releasing body camera video capturing the interaction.
You don't see the issue here. You're not parked across 3 lanes.
You touched me first. So
that's right, I told you to back up. Because you're going to try and get in the car. I'll do what I want, all right? I own this right here.
You don't own me.
Take your hands out of your pockets now!
Brown!
Taser! Taser! Taser!
As a human being, I am offended by what I saw on the video.
And to get tasered over a parking spot, that shows that it's only because of either him being black or just whoever reacted that way just having a bad day.
Our department conducted an investigation into the incident which revealed members acted inappropriately, and those members were recently disciplined.
Mr. Brown deserves an apology, and I am very sorry the Milwaukee police treated him in the fashion he was treated.
I'm sorry this incident escalated to this level.
Yesterday, the Milwaukee Police Department apologized for the treatment of Bucks guard Sterling Brown.
According to the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, Brown plans to file a civil rights lawsuit against the Milwaukee Police Department.
Really just hold, the officers accountable, hold future officers accountable, and have the city make a commitment to, the people in the community, saying that they're going to try to change some of their ideas and thoughts and policies and try to help, as many people in the community not get involved in a situation like this. They wanted to control the situation. They wanted to show their force, their power.
WTMJ News presents a community conversation, a one-hour special on the controversial tasing of Milwaukee Bucks guard Sterling Brown. Joined in the studio by Markasa Tucker, director of the African American Roundtable, and Mandela Barnes, former state representative and Milwaukee resident, longtime Milwaukee resident. Markasa, Mandela, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Markasa, what disturbs you most about the Sterling Brown incident?
That it's something that we continue to see. So it didn't start with Sterling Brown. This has been going on for generations and generations. So when folks saw that it was Sterling Brown, it's just like, oh, well, now it's happened to a Bucks player. And, this is not the first time a Bucks player has had a negative interaction with police. I forgot who the other one was.
John Henson.
Yeah. So it's like, this was not a surprise to folks in the black community. We've seen this before. It's just, again, like, oh, it's Sterling.
Markasa, I was watching your face as you were listening to some of the video audio there. What was going through your mind when you were hearing that?
And just like John was saying, just dreading knowing that I was going to hear Sterling grunting and just knowing what was happening at that moment, how he was feeling with his face pressed up against the ground and having to experience that over a traffic violation is sickening.
What should happen to the officers that were involved in this incident, Markasa?
My stance hasn't changed. They need to be fired. And after reading the Journal-Sentinel today, and it sounds like they got their hands on the police reports, and according to the Journal-Sentinel, and from the things that we've also heard, Sterling wasn't aggressive. So to me, like, this is an integrity issue. And even if this was a draft police report, he wasn't aggressive. He was standing there asking questions. He wasn't, all in his face. He wasn't hands up or, using his body language or anything. He was just sitting there calmly. So for me, it's an integrity issue. If we're talking about video, we've asked for body cameras, we got them. And so now we're actually capturing something that someone said did or did not happen to him. And the officer's account is not truthful. We all saw that he was not being aggressive. So why was it documented that he was?
Mandela, I want to bring you into the conversation. You and I have talked many times about race in this city. You grew up in this city. When you see something like this unfold, does it shake your faith in our community? What is your reaction?
Well, that's the thing. Like Markasa said, it's not anything new. It's something like that most people my age, my demographic have experienced at some point. I haven't gotten tased, but the intimidation factor, where there may be more officers than necessary to handle a very a situation that just doesn't call for it. So the fact that it is someone who has some level of fame, some that people know who he is, it helps to elevate this kind of situation that just goes on almost every day. I mean, you look at the 6th District Milwaukee police officers who were doing the illegal cavity searches. Like, nothing has changed. That is the real problem. And, to answer the question that was asked of Markasa, which is the most disturbing part, it is the fact that they lied, because that makes them a threat to public safety.
That's right.
You can't just lie on a police report. If you or me as a citizen, any of us in this room, if we were to falsify a police report, we could be criminally charged. So there is a real problem if those who are entrusted to uphold the law are have expressed or have acted in this sort of way to just create this air of distrust. And I think anybody should be afraid and concerned right now.
Absolutely.
Now, Mandela, you mentioned that you grew up in the city.
Mm-hmm.
You have dealt with racial bias in the past. How did you deal with that? How did you handle that yourself?
And that's the worst part about it, because it's so ingrained in our society and in community that we just say, oh, well, that's just kind of the way it goes. Like, you sort of expect to have police encounters in certain situations that should not call for police encounter. I mean, that's the worst part about it. It's so normalized where it is just almost just a fact of life.
So there's a lot of people that are shocked by watching this video. You weren't necessarily.
Oh, you absolutely know something like that can happen.
Yeah.
And, I've seen police officers be very aggressive in times. And, I text John the other day. I've actually saw a white officer on a horse grab a white woman by the hair one day during a situation in downtown Milwaukee and throw her to the ground. This was about 10 years ago. I mean, it happens a lot, but it disproportionately impacts communities of color.
Mandela, as you and I texted back and forth the other day, I was asking you to come on the show. I sensed in your text that you weren't surprised.
No.
You weren't even really angry. You were disappointed that we continue to have this discussion. Is that a fair characterization?
Oh, that's more than a fair characterization. And it's sad that we are at that point where we are somewhat desensitized to this, and we sell ourselves short as far as being a black person in this city, in this state, and in this country by not deciding to forego certain experiences because we think there may be a police interaction or something that the feeling of feeling like you're not welcome. Mm-hmm. Somewhere in your own community, in your own city. I know a lot of people who are like, hey, man, let's go down here. Like, I probably don't want to go down there. And it's like, why? They don't really want us there. And that is the truth.
Markasa, in the African-American community, is this front and center? Is this something that literally, when it's nice out and people are going to be hanging outside and, cops are going to be rolling around and that certain members of the African-American community actively worry about this? Is this front and center, or is it kind of in the back of the mind?
Oh, this is front and center every day we wake up in our black skin, and just like Mandela was saying, I mean, I have two black brothers. So, I mean, just like you were talking about not wanted in certain parts of the community on a regular day, we lived not too far from Brown Deer, and it was known, don't ride through Brown Deer. So this is not something that we think about just because we see a video or we see something on TV. This is something that we wake up and breathe every day, unfortunately, where folks are wondering whether or not, moms really had these conversations with their sons about like what to do, what not to do, how to wear your hat, don't have too many people in your car, don't have your music too loud, don't have your windows tinted, all of this extra stuff just to go out to live, So this is something that people think about all the time.
Markasa, if you were sitting across from the officers involved in Brown's arrest, what would you say to them?
For me, it's always a heart issue. These are things that are rooted in people's hearts. These are things that people have been taught. These are things that people have seen, and it's just something that's rooted in people. And it's really unfortunate that someone, if they were sitting here, it's really unfortunate that they would accept a job and an oath to do something like this, only to be in this position to abuse their power and to also brutalize people, harass people, agitate something that was completely unnecessary. I felt, just watching Sterling in that video and just like you said, kind of being surrounded at that moment, it's beyond nervousness. And, his dad is a former officer from Chicago. So it's like, it's beyond nervousness. At this point, you're fearing your life. Not, we hear officers say that, oh, I fear my life. No. Sterling is fearing his life at this point, standing surrounded by these officers, just wanting to figure out why is all of this happening.
This is a WTMJ community conversation, the Sterling Brown incident. We're with Markasa Tucker and Mandela Barnes. Mandela, you sat in that chair with us after Sherman Park, and we had the discussion about where we stand with race in the city of Milwaukee. Are we in a better spot or a worse spot than we were after Sherman Park?
I wouldn't say that we're better at all. I guess, maybe more people are starting to pay attention after something like this, especially, you look at, we'll say the NBA fan base, people who watch the Bucks and people who may have been totally dismissed from a conversation like this or may have never, ever felt the need to have a discussion about race and how policing in communities is impacted by race. Maybe we are making some inroads now, but it's very incremental, right? We're moving inches and we have miles to go.
All right, you mentioned the Bucks. I'm going to ask Greg to tell us what the Bucks are saying in just a second here. But first, I want to play. This is Mike Crivello, the head of the Milwaukee Police Association. He represents the men and women, many of them involved in this incident. I want you to listen to this and then ask for you to respond to it. This is Mike Crivello on Wisconsin's Afternoon News.
Are there things in the video that could have gone different or better? Probably. In every situation that we ever engage ourselves in, the best thing we can do is debrief it and find out ways that we could have handled the situation better. What strikes me right away is that it's 2 o'clock in the morning. We're in a area of high prostitution, high crime, and we got an officer working all by himself. He sees a car that's parked across parking spots in something less than a conventional manner, and those parking spots are handicapped. So what should be going through that officer's mind? Is there a robbery going on here? Is this a situation where a motorist is in distress? Or is it someone who just doesn't simply care? At any rate, the situation has to be addressed.
That is Mike Crivello, the head of the Milwaukee Police Association. This is a WTMJ community conversation on the Sterling Brown incident. As soon as the audio, started to play, Mandela, you sank back in your chair. You started shaking your head. What is your reaction?
Because it's a real problem. We won't get anywhere unless we start to admit fault. Like in my own personal life, I have to admit fault. In our personal relationships, we have to admit fault if we ever want to grow and become better. And I want the Milwaukee Police Department to become better, because if something happens to me, if my house gets broken into, I'm going to call the police. If something bad happens, I'm going to call the police. So I want them to be at their best. But if we have people who continue to sort of dismiss any responsibility or absolve themselves completely in this sort of situation where we have all the evidence we need, and people who have never been critical of police officers that I know are like, are now starting to rethink a lot of their own thought process, and as far as their perception of what policing should be in this city. So yeah, I mean, I just, and I have I talked to Mike Crivello a lot. We know each other personally. I just wish that more responsibility was taken in this sort of instance, because this is a chance for them to sort of, change the perception about the police union, because people have all sorts of thoughts about the police union. This could be one of those moments where it's like, all right, well, we can bridge some gaps. Let's become closer with the community. Let's talk about, where we could have improved and why we may have, as officers, may have taken that situation the way that they did.
We always say people always say change needs to happen when they see something like this. Mandela, Markasa, what do you suggest happens next? How do we move forward? Where does this change start?
So one of the demands that I made during my press conference is policies have to change. And so that's dealing with the Fire and Police Commission. And so I am the chairwoman along with co-chair Fred Royal of the Milwaukee Collaborative Reform Committee. And so we are still working on that DOJ draft report. We have completed most of our hubs, I think all of our hubs. We may be reaching out to the police department yet again to organize some hubs. But once those recommendations from the community are going forward, we want to make sure that the community's recommendations are not washed down. And the Fire and Police Commission maybe goes back and look at some of these standard operating procedures, and let's get them updated to represent what we think that they should really honestly, because right now the policies that are in effect give a slap on the wrist of 15-day suspension, when again a lot of people believe that when you are not integral in a job and you're lying, you should not have your job. If I was lying on my job and getting on TV and lying, or getting here on the radio and lying, I probably wouldn't have a job either. So why is it that someone that we are paying would continue to get paid and have their job?
Yeah, and one thing Mike Crivello mentioned is that there was an officer who was alone by himself, and I don't know where this officer comes from, but speaking about the department as a whole, you look at the number of public employees who have moved out of the city, and my opinion has always been, if you can't live in the community, then there's no reason you should be comfortable policing the community. And that's why you see officers who have this level of fear of the people that they are sworn to protect and serve. So getting back, I mean, all the policies that Markasa is talking about, but also the fact of police living amongst the people, living by the same law that they have to uphold.
I have something else to add too. I'm sorry.
No,
Are you done?
Go ahead. Yeah, please.
I mean, the culture needs to change as well. I mean, we know why police were established. I mean, it's rooted in slavery and starting there. So if we still are going to continue to walk in the same culture, and those standard operating procedures and policies are all the same and haven't been updated and haven't been changed. It's like we're still policing based off of where we were a long time ago. So if the culture isn't changed and the hearts of people are not changed, which is nothing that, we can honestly do, unfortunately, we're going to, I feel like, continue to go in circles around this.
This is a WTMJ community conversation, the Sterling Brown incident. We asked the Bucks to be on the show. The Bucks declined politely to do that, but they have issued a statement. Greg Matzik, you've got the statement?
Yeah, the Bucks have not had much to say on this. The statement was released on May 23rd. I'll read a portion of it to you, John. We can comment on it following, but it would go to say, the abuse and intimidation that Sterling Brown experienced at the hands of Milwaukee police was shameful and inexcusable. Sterling has our full support as he shares his story and takes action to provide accountability. Unfortunately, this isn't an isolated case. It shouldn't require an incident involving a professional athlete to draw attention to the fact that vulnerable people in our communities have experienced similar and even worse treatment. It would go on to say racial biases and abuses of power must not be ignored. There must be more accountability. And finally, John, as an organization, the Bucks plan to stand by Sterling Brown and build and work with local leaders and organizations to foster safe neighborhoods and a better community.
All right, that is the Milwaukee Bucks. We also asked the Milwaukee Police Department to be part of this conversation. They declined. That's why we're having the conversation. If some people don't want to talk about it, there's probably something to talk about.
John, there was another aspect to Mike Crivello's comments. He was very adamant when we had him on in February that there was reason and just cause for Sterling Brown to be tased and that he was combative. I've watched the video, and he was not combative. So you're talking about the foundation here. Was this a guy in Mike Crivello who just was responding to what he heard, a conversation, or reading a police report? Or was he trying to cover up a story that he thought might just sort of go away? And if that's the case, that's a big problem with the foundation here. And how often is this happening other places? I don't know the answer. I don't want to speculate.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what he told me. He did say that. You're absolutely right. And then he told me that he made that comment based on reports from officers on the scene. Bucks, let's stick with this for a minute. You guys will remember this. This is what Peter Fagan said in 2016. Very bluntly, Milwaukee is the most segregated, racist place I've ever experienced in my life. This is the president of the Bucks, Peter Fagan. It's a place that's antiquated. It's in desperate need of repair and has happened for a long, long time. One of our messages and one of our goals is to lead by example. Peter Fagan, president of the Bucks. He then walked it back a couple days later and said, well, I didn't really mean it, but he said it. Most segregated, racist place I've ever experienced in my life, and he's lived all around the country. What do you think of that statement, Markasa Tucker? So
the first thing I think about, and when you think of leadership in cities, so what's happening from the top down? Like what's happening starting in the mayor's office? The African American Roundtable, we were doing some strategy sessions, and out of all of the leaders that were at that table that day, we were like, is there a racial equity plan in Milwaukee somewhere? Like if there is, we haven't heard of it. And why not when segregation is one of the biggest issues in Milwaukee? Why isn't it being addressed? Why isn't it fabric through the thread of every single program and every single agency and office in Milwaukee, starting from the mayor's office? I don't know if maybe there is one. I don't know about it. But again, why wouldn't we know about it if it was? It's that important.
Mandela. He says Milwaukee is the most segregated, racist place I've ever experienced in my life.
Yeah, and so Markasa and I were talking out afterwards, or talking before we got on, and we both went to college in the South. And to have gone to college in the South and be here in Milwaukee, it's just a difference, right? Like when she was in Louisiana, I was in Alabama, and you just know, right? It's not big of a secret, but here it's so institutionalized, it's so ingrained, you just don't know. And that's the scarier part about it. I would rather it be upfront and outward instead of people, hiding motives, or just have it ingrained in a police force, have it ingrained in certain structures that people rely on just to go day by day in their lives. So
you mentioned the mayor. I want to play what the mayor had to say to us just a couple of days ago, 2 days ago, about the Sterling Brown incident. As you've had now time to digest not only the tape, but how people have responded to what they saw, Sterling Brown has now spoken about it. What's the number one takeaway you have from the release of the tape?
Well, I always go back to respect. We have to have the situation. I probably even have said it to both of you. I need this to be a city. In fact, we need this to be a city where our residents can work with and respect our police officers. I need to have that. I also need it to be a city where our police officers can work with and respect our residents. It has to be a two-way street. And obviously there are complications here because of the race issues. That nobody can deny that the race is an issue here. And I think that's something we have to work on. We have to do better. We have to do better.
Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett. All right, I want to ask you this question. I know what the standard answer is, but think about this for a second. In our lifetime, in the next decade, let's say, can we solve this? Can we fix this? Every time this happens, and I've spoken to you about this in the past, it seems we say we need to do A, B, and C. We think it'll happen. We're cautiously optimistic. Given the state of where we are today in this city, is it realistic to expect that in 10 years we'll have this figured out, or we'll have this at least somewhat solved? Is that possible?
The racism issue or the segregation issue or the police issue?
The racism and how it interacts with the police issue.
Unless somebody gets really serious about doing it. And, people have talked about it for as long as it's been a problem, which is forever. But nobody's really implemented any real institutional change or any policies that would create institutional change. That's the scary part. And it takes real leaders to make that happen. People who actually understand the issue, not just because they read it, but people who have experienced issues. How many times are people in the decision-making room who have been affected unjustly by a police interaction, or people who experience it day to day just because of the community that they live in? And I think that when we have the conversations, we want to have the quote unquote smartest people in the room to figure it out rather than the affected people in the room to figure it out.
Markasa, are you optimistic? Is it realistic? How are you feeling when you think about what needs to happen and the likelihood that this gets solved before we're all old and gray?
Okay, so first and foremost, I serve a really big, awesome God. So I'm going to start there first. But then also, me being the chairwoman of this committee, this is something that's never happened before, where this is a collaborative effort where it's supposed to be with the mayor's office, the common council, the fire and police commission, the police department, and the community leading. So this is something different. So I'm hopeful in that. I feel like they picked the right person to help lead that, and organizing with a community of people. And yeah, lots of people are beyond tired. So there's been people who have been doing this kind of work prior to me, and they're just like, well, Markasa, we already did that, but if you got the energy, go ahead and do it. Well, yep, it's my time, so I will do it, and I will continue to organize community and other people who've got the energy to do it. And we may have to go about it, we will go about it some different ways. We've got to get radical about some things, and we got to think way outside the box. Otherwise, we are going to continue to go in this same circle.
Markasa Tucker, African-American Roundtable, doing some important work in our city. Mandela Barnes, former state representative, Milwaukee native. Thank you for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Also, thank you very much to Robert Willis, who was with us during the first half hour. For more on this community conversation, this WTMJ community conversation, go to WTMJ.com. It will be posted there.